Okay, Roman numeral III from the first chapter is actually dealing with forms of government. And I wanted to hit on this fairly quick because a lot of this is really just terms from the chapter and it's fairly quick, not really discussion kinds of things. And hopefully this will help us make up maybe 10 or 15 minutes from that first class that I missed the second week of school. But Roman numeral III, forms of government. There's two basic kinds. One of them is known as a unitary system. The other one is known as a federal system. In a unitary system, basically what you've got is you've got a country that is going to have one federal government. And it's going to be primarily the federal government that ultimately makes all of the decisions. Now, what's nice about this, under the unitary system, a good example of this is going to be France. France has got one primary central government, and there are some smaller governments that are there, but in a country like France or in a country like Israel, you really know what government is going to be the one that's making the decisions. There's going to be a clear line of authority there, so that I wouldn't quite say that it's jump how high when the federal government makes its declarations, passes its laws, issues its declarations. But the idea is that it's very, very close to that. The problem that comes up sometimes in these unitary systems is because there's one government or one size that effectively tries to fit all, there can be some regionalism problems. When you think about a country like Canada, for instance, in Canada, Quebec is something of a breakaway province because they're still speaking the French language. And if the government is too focused on one size fitting all, sometimes regions in the country can rebel a little bit or pull away a little bit or cause problems a little bit for the national government. Now, that's not to say that Canada is the best example of a unitary system, but that's just to say that in unitary systems, sometimes there can be regions in that country that don't feel represented, and in fact, they're going to cause problems because of this lack of representation. Now, in the United States, we've got what's known as a federal system. And when you consider a federal system, really what we're talking about here is the idea that there are going to be more than one level of government that is going to be ruling over you at the same time. Think about it in its most basic sense like this. If you're living in Montgomery County, Maryland, you are going to be subject to the jurisdiction of the United States government. That makes sense. You're going to be subject to the state of Maryland government. That makes sense. If you're in Rockville, you're going to be subject to the Rockville city government, and then certainly there are going to be some Montgomery County governments that fall within that as well. So believe it or not, you could have 3, 4, 5, 6 different governments depending upon where you are, or at least 3, 4, 5, 6 different ruling bodies that are governing over you at the same time. Now, to turn to the chapter on this, on page 65, just to give you a quick quote, and this is the first full indented paragraph under federal systems. Third line, it says, in federal systems, the central government has exclusive control over foreign, defense, and monetary policy. The states typically control education, police, highways, and other close-to-home affairs. Because the division of these powers is seldom clear or permanent, a federal government rests on a delicate balance between central power and local autonomy. When you think about it, the laws that are going to be here in Maryland are going to be different than the laws that are going to be in North Carolina or New York or Texas or New Mexico or Hawaii. And that's one of the beauties of the federal system. The idea is that yes, the United States government keeps it all together at the federal level, but each state is going to be free to do the things that it wants to do for its people, and it's not going to be a one-size-fits-all type of approach. So there are going to be different gun laws, for example, or there would be different abortion restrictions or requirements, for example. Although guns and abortions are going to be legal in all places, some of the regulations surrounding them would suit the local populations of the given states. Now, a couple of things. Laboratories of democracy. And when you think about it, the beauty of this is that states are going to be laboratories of democracy, or effectively they're going to be able to practice different policies. When you think about it, Wyoming, and I went to graduate school out in Wyoming. Wyoming is known as the equality state. Wyoming was actually the first state in the country that gave women the right to vote. They almost were not allowed to join the Union because they gave women the right to vote. But if you look at it, Wyoming's experiment giving women the right to vote turned into a constitutional amendment which gave women the right to vote everywhere. Georgia, for example, gave 18-year-olds the right to vote first. So it wasn't always 18 to be able to vote. Georgia is another example. Their experiment turned into a policy that ultimately became a constitutional amendment so that it covers the entire United States. Some people would argue that before Obamacare became Obamacare, it was actually Romney Care from the fine state of Massachusetts, which means that they developed their health policies up there, their health insurance policies up there, and because it was considered successful, it was actually sent ultimately to all 50 states in the form of Obamacare. So again, the idea is that you can experiment. The good experiments will take over and they'll go all around the country. Now, on the converse side of this, there is legalized prostitution in Nevada. Well, that experiment did not take off. And you don't see legalized prostitution in Maryland, for instance, so not everything that's an experiment becomes a national law. In fact, many of them don't. But the idea that women's vote, or the 18-year-old vote, or the idea of Obamacare, for instance, these would all be examples of things that started as a local experiment that turned into a federal policy. Now, to give you one more quote, and this is actually going to take us to page 68 from the chapter, and it says here, and it's just pretty straightforward kind of a thing. This is the last indented paragraph, talking about federal systems. If the components are too different from one another, culturally, economically, linguistically, or historically, a federal system will not hold together. A shared political culture, as in the United States, Australia, Brazil, and Germany, is a big help. This is basically saying, when you think about it, it's nice to have this idea of these laboratories of democracy. It's nice, when you think about it, to have different levels of government. This all makes sense. Having said this, if the people are too distinct, if the culture is too different, if there are huge differences in economics, in wealth, in different regions of, say, a given country, then these federal systems have a tendency of tearing themselves apart, because instead of one government overseeing a lot of other laboratories of democracy, if you will, what you end up seeing is that these laboratories of democracy start conducting experiments that really just contradict each other, and they begin to blow up. They begin to fight away against from the federal system kind of a thing sometimes. It begins to pull itself apart. So understand on this, just because you create multiple levels of government, and it does sound good on paper, and it can work in reality, in fact, the fact is that if there's too much difference between the people, the fact is that it isn't actually going to work. Now, a couple of other things, and I'll jump into letter C up here as far as elections are concerned, and this will be fairly straightforward. There's two basic kinds of elections that are out there. One of them is known as a single-member district, and one of them is known as proportional representation. Let's say, for example, that we've got 3 people that are running for office, and let's say that we've got, I don't know, we've got Charlotte that's running for office, we've got Willie that's running for office, and in fact, we've got Jake that's running for office. Now, in a single-member district, basically the idea is that the person that gets the most votes wins the election. We have a tendency of thinking that majority rules. And in its most basic sense, a majority is going to be 50% plus 1. 50% plus 1%, 50% plus 1 vote. That's majority rule. Well, in a single-member district, what you've got is it's the first person, or it's going to be the person that gets the most votes, whether it's a majority or not. So in this example, let's just say that Charlotte got 44% of the vote. Let's say that Willie got 42% of the vote. And let's say that Jake actually got 14% of the vote. Nobody got a majority. But Charlotte, in this instance, is the winner because Charlotte was the person that actually got the most votes. This is what is known in this instance as a plurality. When you get the most votes without getting a majority, or 50% plus 1, you have won with a plurality of the vote. What's interesting about these is that typically in these single-member elections, what you see is that the votes have a tendency, the electorate, the candidacy, the campaign, all of these things have a tendency of gearing toward the center. So when you think about it, in its most recent presidential election, you had Obama over here on one side, and you had Romney who was over here on the other side. Well, when Romney was running against Obama, Romney, of course, is going to have his Republicans here. Obama is going to have his Democrats here. And I'd venture to say that maybe about 35% of the country, give or take, is Democrat. Maybe about 30% of the country, give or take, is Republican. The problem is that there's this 35% here that's in the center, And ultimately, this is going to be the group that's going to decide who wins or who loses a presidential election. So when Romney was running in the primaries, he was basically trying to consolidate all of his people over here to make sure that he was guaranteed the 30%. Obama was basically trying to consolidate all of his people over here to make sure that he had those 35, and then ultimately both of the sides began to move to figure out who was going to gain the bulk of this 35% that was undecided in the center. Obama did a better job of it. Obama got elected president. Now in this, the idea is that you're going to get a majority. The fact is it doesn't always happen that way. Now what's nice about this is that while you might not get a majority of the vote, if Charlotte, for example, is a Democrat and Willie is a Republican and Jake down here is an independent, odds are one of these parties, typically the Democrats when you talk about the federal legislature, are going to be able to control a majority of the seats, and they're going to be able to pass the laws that they need. Right now, in the United States Senate, the Democrats have that majority. Problem for them is that in the House right now, the Republicans have that majority. So both parties have a majority in one. They kind of have a stalemate sometimes when it comes to actually getting some things done. The problem with these elections is that oftentimes they become very, very dull. People don't pay attention to them because in the beginning, if everybody's talking about Republican issues on the Republican side and everybody's talking about Democratic issues on the Democratic side, it begins to be dull because you're trying to appeal to this 35% that's in the center, which means you're toning down your rhetoric, you're watering down your message, and it's going to be as much about not offending people as it's going to be about actually gaining their votes and getting elected. Proportional representation is the other one, and I'll be fairly brief with this. In terms of proportional representation, it's a little bit different. If you notice in the plurality, the single-member district example, I had candidates' names. Well, in a proportional system, it's not actually going to be candidates' names, but it's going to be party names. So with this in mind, what you're going to have is ultimately you're going to have, I don't know, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. You could just keep going and going with parties. But the idea here is if party A gets 22% of the vote, and if party B gets 21, if party C gets 7% of the vote, if party D gets 34, and then if party E gets 16. If you have a 100-seat legislature, under a proportional representation kind of a system, Party A will get 22 seats. Party B will get 21. Party C is going to get 7. Party D, 34. And then Party E is going to get 16 seats. Now, the beauty of this, and if you remember from that first election, Charlotte got 44% of the vote. If you do the math, that means that 56% of the people actually voted against her. And when they voted against her, they don't get any seats in the legislature. They're basically ignored until the next election. Well, in a proportional system, what you've got is that this is going to very accurately represent the voters. Because when you think about it, Party A only got 22% of the seats, but they're going to have a voice in the government. Party C only got 7% of the seats, but they are going to have a voice in the government. Party D got the most. They only got 34 seats. So what this means is, in order to get a majority, Party D is going to have to group up with at least one other party. Or in fact, a number of these other parties are going to have to group up against Party D in order to figure out who's going to be in control. Now the problem with this, while it's wonderful that it is very, very reflective of the voters, and it seems like that's a good idea, the problem is there's an old phrase, too many cooks will spoil the soup. The more parties that get in the legislature, the more deal cutting that's got to go on. And let's say that Party A and Party D join so that they control 56% of the seats. Well, they're going to run the government until they decide to dissolve. And in fact, these divorces, if you will, happen frequently. And what could conceivably happen is Party A, Party B, and Party E could join together. And now you're getting to the point where they've got 59% of the vote, so they now are in control. But as soon as they begin to disagree, then in fact, guess what happens? They are going to break up too. I give this to you because when you look at single-member districts, people vote for the people. They vote for a candidate, and then that candidate gets into office, and you can say, well, Representative so-and-so is from my district, and he or she represents me. Having said this, if Charlotte was elected with 44% of the vote a few minutes ago, that means that 56% of the people voted against her, and that means that 56% of the people cannot necessarily say that Charlotte is their representative. A majority ruled against, or when you think about it, majority voted against her, majority didn't rule in that situation. In a proportional system, what's nice about this is that you're going to have everybody getting their voice in. Instead of voting for the candidate, though, you vote for the party, and then the party picks the people who take over in office. Now, again, what's nice about this is it's very, very accurate. It's very, very proportional, you might say. But the idea of who is actually in charge of the government, it's very difficult to figure out because these parties are going to be free to join together and dissolve, and join together and dissolve an awful lot over the course of time until the next election, which means while it's reflective, it's not stable. The plurality system is stable, but it's not reflective.